Hi everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit today about a Laci Green video that popped up on my Facebook feed yesterday. And this isn't going to be a criticism necessarily of her video, more just some observations that I've made. And actually, I'm quite supportive of some of the things that Laci talks about in the video, but I do see some slippery slope here that I think maybe Laci herself isn't aware of, and quite often I think feminists in general aren't aware of. It's sort of this idea of ideology versus adjectives, I guess. It sometimes for me becomes a situation of feminism versus freedom, feminism versus egalitarianism, and I'll try to explain that a little bit as I go on. So the video that she's talking about a television sitcom. It's kind of a cartoon, I guess, called Bob's Burgers. Now, I haven't seen Bob's Burgers, so this is going to be my commentary on her commentary because I don't know the source material all that well. And she's talking about how it is a feminist masterpiece. And I think that's where the trouble begins, actually, is labeling it as such. In fact, in the comments section of that video, there are people already challenging that on feminist grounds, saying that there's areas of transphobic episodes and other things in there. And so to call it feminist is dangerous. And this gets to a little bit of the no true Scotsman thing. You know, that's one of the issues I would have with labeling something like that. Feminist is... There are some things that some feminists purport or promote that other feminists would say that's not feminism and you're not a real feminist, and vice versa. So there's a bit of an issue there with calling something that versus calling something open-minded, sex positive, which is one of the phrases she likes to use quite often, gender neutral, which is a bit of a dicey term because I don't know if you check, but we are not gender neutral, right? And it seems like the most you can get a feminist to admit is that like men can't have babies. But sexual dimorphism goes far beyond that. It's almost to act as though our hormones have no impact on us whatsoever, right? Like estrogen and testosterone, they have the same impact on people, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do see a problem with giving it that label right off the bat. But more importantly, you know, she talks a lot about challenging gender stereotypes in this video about Bob's Burgers and how they do that in the video. And I'm all for that. Gender stereotypes typically are kind of cultural. And I've said many times in the past on my own videos that culture can die in a pool of fire as far as I'm concerned. That we give this, quite often, we give this reverence to culture. Not only within our own, but sometimes in the way we treat other cultures. We'll rise up a culture to this level of honor, and you know, we'll have cultural museums. And it's one thing to have a historical museum, but quite often I see different seminars being given on cultures around the world, and it's given this reverence as though culture in and of itself has automatic virtue. And really, when you get right down to it, culture is just sort of, culture equals the way things have been done, right? There's no automatic virtue in that. Things have to be virtuous of their own accord, of course. Just like each person should stand on their own accord, should be judged by the content of their character, right? Which is the whole message behind civil equality, civil rights, egalitarianism, and some would claim feminism, but I don't think that's actually the case. And so, you know, the message, the general message there that we should challenge gender stereotypes, I'm all for that. She talks in there about the young girl who is openly discovering her sexuality sort of thing, and that she's a sexual object and not a such sexual subject. That the mother is quite, I guess, open-minded, although she says in there that she's got no filters, which I'm not sure what that means. I don't think that's always a good thing to have no filters. I don't know how you'd know that either, that someone has no filters. I know of several failed experiments with parents who taught their children from a very young age to say whatever they're thinking, say whatever they're feeling. That shit backfires. Discernment is also a key lesson as well. And I've seen these same parents have to do damage control and teach discernment after the fact, right? So I'm not sure no filter is a good thing. But I don't want to get too nitpicky here, right? I don't want to get too pedantic on her video. She also talks about the husband. Well, actually, I do want to stress something else. She mentions in there that the typical or stereotypical display of youth, puberty and youthful sexual exploration is of young men, young boys who are horn dogs, and they're just going after all these girls, and the girls are objects, as she says, standing on the sidelines, and they're responding with either indifference or disgust, or turning them away, and that makes them sexual objects, and he the subject, which I think is missing the point of who is being the decider in that. Now, I do appreciate what she's talking about with the young girl and focusing on her sexual exploration. This is a big pet peeve of mine, is to what I see in our society as the lack of freedom for women to be truly the sexual beings that they are. I actually went, and I think this is probably partially cultural or largely cultural, I went through a large part of my adulthood thinking that women didn't desire sex, that this was a sort of a put-on that women were sort of forced into, that they didn't actually desire it all that much. And I've since been disavowed of that inclination or that idea, but I'm supportive of that. I'm supportive of this idea of this girl being focused upon her wishes and desires and what she's going through. Using that other example of girls rejecting or accepting a boy's advances as turning them into sexual objects, I think is a bit far-fetched, because they're the ones who are actually in control of the situation. She then goes on to talk about the father who goes alongside with his wife and is open-minded and rolls with it, as she said. I was looking for my notes. And she even uses the example of him finding out that his father-in-law has got a balloon fetish, and he's supportive and gives him some non-shaming advice or something, which is not that critical of an issue to have to talk about, And then she mentions how he's okay with his daughter's burgeoning sexuality, unlike the stereotypical, dad with a shotgun, who she says then stalks his daughter and by implication says that he owns her body, which I think if you talk to most, I think that's an unfair characterization. Being a father myself, I think that's an unfair characterization of what I think quite often is a realistic expectation of fathers to protect their families and mothers. And so, how many men, if you're really stalking your daughter, well, that may indicate a lack of trust and a lack of exchange between the two of you. Having had a daughter myself, I never stalked her. I don't think I really ever had to, because we had those discussions, and the thing that I taught her was to honor herself and to ask herself the question in any situation, am I really honoring myself if I make this choice? And then I had to let her make those choices. I did the best I could. Although, if I found out that something untoward was happening or about to happen, I would certainly step in, shotgun or no. I think that's an unfair characterization. I think I understand what she's saying, but I think that's a really rare situation, right? Where a father is actually stalking his daughter to make sure she doesn't get into trouble, as though he owns her body. I'm not sure I buy that. The father in this situation and the young son I see as somewhat emasculated. At least I'm not commenting on Bob's Burgers. I'm really commenting on Laci Green's portrayal of them and the enthusiasm she has for these traits, these character traits. So the father is quite emasculated. It sounds like he rolls with it. He's right alongside his wife. He doesn't seem to express his opinions. And sometimes love is tough, right? That's why they sometimes call it tough love. And sometimes having an opinion that's contrary, it's very, very important to express that. In fact, it can be unloving to not express that and to just roll with it. And of course, giving the example about the father-in-law having a balloon fetish, it's kind of a non-essential issue, right? It's pretty easy to roll with that, because it's what impact does it really have on the father? And similarly with the young boy, she talks about the son, and I don't know if the son in Bob's Burgers expresses desire for females, for girls, or boys, whatever it is. That's not really discussed, at least in the Laci Green video. She says he embraces the feminine, And he's kind of focused on his own body. He likes being naked, and he talks intimately about his body parts. But she doesn't really express that he's interested in the opposite sex or even the same sex. He sort of seems self-obsessed in some way. And at one point she says that he says he only makes friends with women or girls, I guess. And that's a successful jab at the old cliche that she was familiar with or liked as a 16-year-old version of herself. I only am friends with boys. And then she's got a boop, thumbs down sound with that. The concern I have with all that is labeling all that as feminist. At one point she talks about the young girl too, and she says, she's got all these traits, and then she's just like us, guys. Well, who's she talking to? Is everybody the same? Or all feminists the same? Do they all have wet dreams about zombies? Which is something she said in the video, which I find kind of weird. And taking these people, this family, this Bob's Burgers family, and suggesting that this is an ideal by calling it feminist. I totally understand challenging gender stereotypes, challenging cultural norms. I'm all for that. And I think that's what you have to do. I think a truly egalitarian, truly free society looks like whatever it looks like. You challenge cultural norms, you challenge gender stereotypes, but you have to let the results play out. And it concerns me that someone would be saying, here is the ideal. And that's what she's doing when she calls this a feminist masterpiece, that the mother dispenses or spews feminist advice, and that this character is a decidedly feminist character. She's talking about an ideal here. She talks about the littlest girl gender bending, which is fine. She's sort of, defy the gender stereotypes. That's fine. I know lots of little girls who gender bend as well. We don't even have to give it that name, though. It's just called freedom. And that's the message I would like to get across is when we talk about some kind of utopian future where there is true egalitarianism and true freedom, we're talking about adjectives here. We're not talking about ideologies. Feminism is not an adjective. It's an ideology. And freedom is descriptive. Egalitarian is descriptive. And in a future, we can't know what that's going to look like. What you can't do, I think, is then demonize. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a mistake to take some of the cultural norms and then demonize them and say, no, here is the ideal. And that's what I see Laci doing somewhat in this video by not saying I love this program because it challenges gender stereotypes and cultural norms, but by saying this is a feminist masterpiece. That's the crux of what I'm clumsily trying to get at here. Because then it demonizes, as has happened in our culture now, white cisgendered males, right? It's sort of the demonized class. It demonizes certain behaviors. So if you have a woman who wants to behave in what would be normally considered in our culture today, a culturally normal, gender stereotypical way, that somehow isn't good for her. Or to use Laci's own example, referring to what she calls a successful jab in Bob's Burgers of the boy saying that he only has girls as friends. And relating this to her own youth where she had much the same sentiment, that she only had guys as friends. And she now gives that the big thumbs down, probably because she recognizes that this was culturally influenced and sort of gender stereotype type sentiment. And I'm fine with that, of course. But what you can't do is you can't assume that that's the case in all cases, right? That in every case where someone says, I only have the opposite gender as friends, I only find the opposite sex attractive to have as friends, that's necessarily culturally influenced and that it's a negative thing. And that it's not them just embracing who they are, something that she praises Bob's Burgers for celebrating. Or if a guy wants to be a truck driver and acts in stereotypical, traditional, cultural, male sort of ways, he's responding to cultural norms. I mean, I can't say today, the person that I am today, I'm not divorced from cultural influences, clearly. how much of my choice in the way I live my life today is really based on, some sort of embracing who I am at my core. It's hard to know. It's hard to disconnect. But what you can't do is you can't label that and say that person is behaving that way because of cultural norms and gender stereotypes. You can't know that without knowing their motive, their intent behind it, right? And quite often we don't know that ourselves. So I think the best that you can do is that you can provide an environment where you challenge those cultural norms, you challenge the gender stereotypes, you have acceptance of people, you allow the freedom of people to be who they are, and you have equality of opportunity. As I've said in the past, I don't really believe in equality of opportunity because really what you're talking about there is equality of outcome. And that's not something that you can dictate or control. It's dangerous to try to control equality of outcome. But equality of opportunity, I think is something that we can do, recognizing the actual limitations that exist, the actual physical limitations that exist within some people, the actual mental limitations that exist within some people, the actual gender limitations that exist within us, the actual sexual dimorphism that scientifically exists, and then let everything else be acceptance and equality and freedom, etc., etc. And towards the end of the video, she talks about how this whole family, they embrace who they are, and even if it's a little bit weird. But I think, again, to tag that with the ideological tagline of feminist, I think is a little bit dangerous because I think it starts to paint a picture of the ideal other and to demonize the cultural norms, which, as I said before, the cultural norms don't have some sort of automatic validity, but nor do they have automatic invalidity, right? They're not automatically bad either. They have to stand on their own merits, and we have to evaluate these things on their own merits. I'm all for challenging the cultural stereotypes and the gender norms and all that. I think there's a difference between egalitarianism and freedom and feminism. And the last thing I want to say before I wrap up this terrible, clumsy worded video is towards the end, she has some comments from people talking about gender-neutral bathrooms. I guess it's probably a response to another video or a talk that she had. And someone had said, written from Sweden, and they'd said, I've never seen, segregated bathrooms here. They're all combined. And Laci Green kind of lamented that Sweden is so far ahead of everybody in this regard and many others. And then the very next comment said that she has a lot of concerns about combined bathrooms because fearing harassment from cisgendered males. And Laci Green concurred with her 10,000%. And I guess that's not a gender stereotype that she wants to challenge, right? And that's not to say that some cisgendered men would not harass women in bathrooms, but the automatic assumption there is that no woman would ever harass a man in a co-ed bathroom, and that all men or most men or some men would be doing the harassing. And it's not that I don't see that as a real problem, because I know that people behave badly. Not men, people. People behave badly. And I just wish that that's something that would be challenged more, because I think the way out of that problem is to challenge that too, and to have some true egalitarianism and admit female violence, admit female proxy violence, admit female manipulation, etc., at the same time as you're talking about male brutality and violence and other things like that. And that was just glossed over. She just agreed with it 10,000%. So all in all, I think it's an interesting video. She makes a lot of good points, and I'm all for challenging cultural norms and stereotypes. I just think it's dangerous when it gets tied to an ideology, as she's attempting to do. And I'm not sure that the originators of Bob's Burgers have that intent, or they're just open-minded people, if they're just free egalitarian people who embrace all different kinds of lifestyles, or if they're notably feminists, self-identified feminists. But I think it's a little bit dangerous. I'd like to know what you think. Leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.